After trekking halfway across the city, avoiding several patrolling Covenant ships and squads of aliens, he came to a sealed security gate that denoted one of the many connection points between the eastern and southern quadrants. The security gate beeped as if in response to its presence, and the multifaceted door sheathed away. The city beyond was a stark contrast again to the urban sprawl he was leaving. The southern quadrant, being the primary industrial zone of the city, was a maze of industrial complexes, smelting plants, refineries, and all manner of automated and manned production systems. While normally it would be a hive of activity, it was almost in perpetual darkness. A message popped up onto his HUD. Power grid inoperable. Please proceed with caution. Hades was still looking out for him. A waypoint winked into existence on his HUD, showing his destination was several hundred meters into the darkness. He activated his helmet lights that cut through the darkness but seemed to be devoured by the void several meters ahead. That's when it started snowing. At first just a few flakes, and then more, and before long it was falling thick onto the ground. The problem was, it wasn't cold enough for snow, and it wasn't melting once it hit the floor. He held out his armoured hand and allowed the flakes to land on his outstretched palm before rubbing his fingers together. The flakes didn't melt. They became streaks of grey. It was ash. Enormous clouds of ash fallout from the burning city was finally settling. Before long, everything was covered in a blanket of grey ash. He imagined the sheer quantity of it would make breathing extremely difficult. He was thankful the suit had air filters built into the helmet. He cautiously continued, feeling all the while he was being watched from just beyond where his light could reach. He hoped it was just paranoia. After several minutes of walking in the dark, a figure loomed ahead. Luke slowed to a near stop. As he drew closer, his lights revealed the body of a large ape-like alien pinned to an emergency blockade by a warthog, now ashen-covered. He got alongside the part simian, part ursine beast and noted several gunshot wounds through its skull, with matching holes in the windshield of the warthog. The driver had evidently run the creature down, pinning it in place and finishing it off with a few headshots for good measure. The driver was still sat in the driving seat, pinned to it in fact via 3 12-inch-long metallic spikes through the chest and shoulder. A large, bayoneted handgun lay on the ground near the front wheel of the vehicle. He turned and continued walking a few steps when he came across a silent battleground. The roadway was littered with 24 Marines amongst twice as many Covenant. A battle between the two forces must have taken place, resulting in near total losses on both sides. The floor was slick with blood, both human and alien. The bodies were marked with projectile wounds, plasma scoring and carbonization. Whatever happened here must have been horrendous. It wasn't long before he found out what. A little further down the way, huddled in a defensible courtyard, ahead of a heat-warped and partially melted evacuation station, was a group of civilians of all ages. They had come here to evacuate the city, and something had fired upon the station, destroying the shuttle, which still lay atop the launch pad, a smouldering wreckage, and cutting off their only means of escape. The Marine presence then held back waves of Covenant infantry before finally falling, allowing the Covenant to massacre the entrapped civilians. They lay where they fell, gunned down with extreme prejudice, executed for the crime of existing. The ash, now falling, was gradually covering them, making their forms more ill-defined, as if the falling city itself was trying to subsume them, to give them the burial they deserved. It was almost beautiful. Almost. He stepped carefully into the courtyard and gazed upon as many of the faces as he could manage, before dropping his head in something approximating a bow and quietly leaving. He walked back to the centre of the street. The ash, now covering everything, had oddly lightened the howling dark of the industrial zone. The ash, being more reflective to light than asphalt, was reflecting what little light was being emitted from the raging fires across the city and his own helmet lights, and reflecting it dimly on every surface nearby, but in a muted, monochromatic tone, masking the city as if it was set in a film noir movie, or worse, a lifeless void, absent of any colour, or indeed hope. Luke stared up to the sky, the same grey as the ground. It made it impossible to tell where the ground ended and the sky began, making everything feel closed in and yet impossibly far off in the distance. His gaze fell to the ground once more, where he spotted the silhouette of a handgun. He picked it up, checked its clip, safetied it and slid it between a gap in his abdominal and waist armour, before taking in the scene around him one more time. On his HUD, an object was highlighted with an attached label, Elite Helmet. He moved to the helmet and picked it up to examine it. A large entry and exit hole had taken off nearly the entire upper surface of the helmet. The inner surface of the helmet was stained with dried purple blood. Mildly disgusted, he went to place it down again, but a message popped up onto his HUD. "Please bring this with you."
Okay.
He moved to one of the fallen Marines nearby and gently removed a hook and loop pouch from his webbing. He threaded the straps through the hole in the helmet and affixed it to a hard point on his waist armour. The damaged elite helmet now hung securely to his belt. He silently thanked the fallen Marine and stood before moving on. After walking down the colossal length of a smelting plant that took raw ores and refined them into industrial-scale bar stock, he noticed the sound of movement up ahead, and the telltale glow of plasma weapons bobbing up and down in the distant ash clouds. He cut his helmet lights and slowly backed into a particularly dark nook made by the shadow of an overhead monorail support. His hulking metal form blended into the darkness and disappeared from view as he watched the bobbing lights resolve into 3 elites, 2 in blue armour, 1 in red, accompanied by 2 jackals carrying elongated rifles, and a group of 6 grunts. They carefully moved through the streets, scanning for movement. One of the grunts ambling by stopped 3 meters shy of Luke's position, examined the darkness, seemingly looking directly at him, sniffed the air enthusiastically, and then moved on. The rest of the group moved by and disappeared into the void. He waited in place a few minutes to ensure no other forces were following them, and that the group had moved far enough away not to hear him. He breathed a sigh of relief, and moved back onto the street and continued on his way. He rounded a corner and came face to face with the tooth-filled maw of one of the ape-like aliens. It bellowed in his face, sending spittle spraying across the gap between them and speckling his visor. He reacted instinctively and punched it in the face with everything he had. The thing shrugged off the blow like it was nothing and grabbed him by the shoulders before hip-tossing him across the street. He slammed into the ground, sparks and ash kicking up as he slid to a stop. In moments, the beast was on top of him. Grabbing his chest armour at the collar, it dragged him to his feet in a single swift motion and punched him square in the chest. The blow sent him staggering backwards as the creature pursued him. Luke readied himself and threw a straight jab, leaning his weight into the blow, and hit it in the face, then chased it with a right hook to the ribs. It grunted in response to the strikes before throwing its own. Luke managed to block the swing and pin it to his own side before the creature punched him again with its offhand and retrieved a stubby-nosed and bladed revolver from its belt and aimed it at him point-blank range. Luke released the creature's pinned arm and attempted to slap the weapon aside. The creature fired and a massive slug tore a deep gouge into his pauldron in a near miss. The round caused him to recoil from the shot, but before the creature had time to correct its aim, he threw himself into the beast, and they both tumbled to the ground, knocking the weapon free. A scuffle broke out on the floor as the two wrestled for dominance. On the floor, weight advantages didn't mean a lot if he was flat on his back, so made the struggle more a battle of technique than size. Luke could handle himself, but was by no means a mixed martial arts expert, yet this thing seemed like it lived for combat, but it didn't mean he had to fight fair. In a brief moment Luke was on top, he headbutted the creature in the face and brought an armoured knee up into its groin, hoping they had similar enough physiology to humans that it had the desired effect. The blow seemed to anger the creature significantly, which seemed to indicate it worked. It rolled him over onto his back and pinned him to the ground, wrapping huge clawed hands around his neck and squeezing. The armour there was thinner, and he could feel the pressure of its grip tightening around his throat. If he didn't do something soon, this thing would choke him out and kill him while he was unconscious. Luke threw a vicious open hand strike to the face, raking the creature's wide-set eyes. It didn't seem overly bothered by this. He repositioned his legs and kneed the creature in the upper thigh and hips, the massive armour plates of his knee driving down through the creature's thick fur and hide and impacting its solid skeleton beneath. It winced in pain and shifted its wider stance to a narrow one, giving him the opening to quickly push himself up and over as the armour's mechanical systems screamed against the forces at play. He found himself on top once more and spread his legs wide, keeping leverage and preventing the creature from reversing the hold again. He rose his torso up with his shoulder blades and brought a headbutt down with all his weight and force, smashing the brim of his helmet into the creature's flattened nose. The blow busted its face open and it began bleeding deep red, nearly purple blood that pooled near its eyes and mouth. It growled and barked something he didn't understand before it tried to grab his left wrist and then tried for the right. But he slipped it and pressed his entire weight, nearly 1.5 tons, through his forearm onto its neck. The creature grimaced against the choke and released his left wrist to grab his right arm with both hands. Astonishingly, the thing started lifting his entire weight free from its neck. He wrapped his left hand around the back of the thing's neck and pulled with all his strength to close the gap again. The suit's movement systems groaned against the force and he headbutted it again, splattering its blood across his visor, the blow causing its strength to falter for a moment, allowing him to crush its throat once more, but it quickly recovered. Luke knew he didn't have much time. He released his grip from the back of its neck, quickly reached for the pistol concealed between his armour panels, pulled it free, clicked off the safety, gripping it awkwardly in his left hand, and shoved the barrel in the creature's mouth before squeezing off 3 rounds in quick succession. The creature flinched to the shots and fell limp. Luke slumped and rolled away onto its back, nearly exhausted from the struggle. He spent a few moments gathering his senses and breathing before rolling onto his hands and knees. He gave a sideways glance to the creature before standing and wiping much of the blood free from his visor. He safetied the pistol and slid it back between his armour plates. A warning strobed on his heads-up display. Low power. This powered exoskeleton was outdated, some might even say ancient, but it carried some more recent innovations like its integrated power cells. While this granted the suit the power it needed to operate without being tethered to a generator, unlike the older, unmodified units, it didn't mean this suit could function endlessly. The physical exertion of the battle with the big dumb ape had come at the cost of a lot of energy, and although this rig could function flawlessly as a heavy goods loader for an intensive 12-hour shift between charges, he'd been running and fighting and skulking around a city for hours now, a level of activity the suit just wouldn't normally operate at. To its credit, however, it had risen to the occasion and kept him alive. He wondered for a minute on the original intentions of the suit, and how much technology may have advanced in the nearly 2 centuries since the first Hunting Mark I platforms came off the production line. By a quick guess, he expected he probably had another hour at best of charge until the suit was out of juice. And since the only place that had the relevant charging station to get it running again was currently buried under hundreds of thousands of tons of polycrete and fallen space tether, once the power ran out, it was nothing but an oversized paperweight, and he'd be all the more vulnerable for it. He had to get moving to safety. The dark was suddenly broken by another Covenant ship arriving on the edge of the southern quadrant and began charging its energy beam. A few moments later, the area was bathed in harsh light as the beam struck the city and the ship began tracing its own line of destruction. He had to get off the streets before that ship got much closer. He started moving more rapidly than he had been, the way now being lit by the powerful plasma beam, occasionally plunging him back into darkness as the shadow of nearby buildings passed over him. The ambient heat started to climb as the ship's immense form moved ever closer, the waves of heat rippling through the air, blew clear the ash that had collected upon every surface he could see, and the heat, kissing his visor, began to escalate from an early morning sunrise to a noon desert blaze. He rounded a corner and found a recessed doorway, blocked by a large mechanical door. He moved towards it, expecting it to open. When it didn't, he remembered that the area was in blackout. The The beam behind him had grown closer, and it roared like a titanic demon come to swallow him whole. 3 blocks away, buildings were sagging and collapsing, spontaneously catching on fire, and then beginning to be enveloped by the rippling white-hot beam. Sweat beaded on his forehead and dripped in his eyes. He punched the seam of the door, then again and again, until it deformed enough to slip his armoured fingers into the gap and pry the door open. His suit's cooling systems were now no longer keeping his temperature down, and he felt the heat stabbing at his back as he finally got the mechanical door wide enough to enter. He slipped through and ran down a 20-metre long slope that came to a 2-tier staircase that dropped 20 feet down to a mezzanine below, and then a further 20 feet to the floor below. He awkwardly stepped down the first dozen narrow steps before striding 2 or 3 steps at a time using the railings to stabilise him that flexed under his weight. He cleared the first tier to the mezzanine, turning on it and looking back up the flight he had come down, to see the harsh white light beaming in through the street-level door, its edges now glowing hot before warping and disappearing in a hail of debris and flame. Luke took a risk and threw himself over the railing, free-falling 20 feet and smashing into the metal grating flooring below. His boot struck the flooring and the metal warped, taking some of the impact. He rocked forward, absorbing the rest with his outstretched arms. The suit's massive knees and actuators helped to buffer the impact, but the weight and force of the impact was still bone-jarring. He felt a sharp pain in his foot that turned into an acute ache that lanced up his leg, and something popped in his right arm. It was quite possible he had just broken something, but there was no time to linger. The ceiling above him began sagging and the heat climbed further. He ran down a concrete corridor that continued on a steady slope deeper underground. The further he went, the cooler it became, and the more distant the sound of hell above him. He came to a large, concrete-reinforced room with heavy-duty lifts at the centre. Lights sparked alive as if detecting his presence, and he boarded the lift. The door closed as it began a steady descent deeper into the underworld of the city. 20 stories below the surface, the lift came to a stop. Luke disembarked and walked through the corridors ahead of him, following lights which winked on ahead. It led him through a labyrinthine area filled with computational systems and coolant pipes, before opening up into an immense cavernous space that was rapidly revealed to him as powerful overhead lights bloomed. He followed seemingly the only access way to the centre, where all of the coolant pipes and cables seemed to come together into an immense monolithic structure, twinkling with soft blue lights of activity. At the foot of the monolith was a large terminal. He approached it and it sparked to life. A holotank activated and a 3D avatar of Hades materialized.
What is this place?
This is my primary data processing center. This is where all major connections from the city feed into my core matrix. From here, I can control and orchestrate the entire city.
Luke looked around the cavernous space in quiet contemplation. Hades gestured to the helmet he still carried.
Please, if you set that down on that workstation.
Luke followed his instruction, removed the damaged helmet from his hip and placed it on the glassy surface. The surface came alive with code and graphical representations as Hades interfaced with its discrete internal electronics.
Why did you want this?
The Covenant can understand us, but we're not as far along at understanding them. I believe they carry translation systems that aid them and give them the strategic edge in engagements. If we can reverse engineer this technology, we'd be able to know a great deal more about their intentions on the battlefield. Yes, this was a worthy find indeed. It contains a full active translation suite and a partially operational BattleNet connection. It likely took some damage from the projectile.
Yeah, meaning?
I can develop a codex, a Rosetta Stone, if you will. If this is delivered to the UNSC, it will enable us to fully translate their languages, and with the implied BattleNet connections, we could even devise a means to infiltrate their networks to decode, interpolate, and even interfere with their troop deployment, chain of command, general coordination. I do not have the resources here to entirely solve the damaged BattleNet, but I can copy this to a device that you can take with you. There.
Hades flatly concluded. A small cigarette packet-sized device rose from a concealed compartment.
It has a magnetic coupler. You should be able to affix it to your thigh.
Luke took the device and placed it on his thigh, the magnetic coupler jumping across the gap and pulling it firmly in place. When he was sure it was secure, he looked to Hades, who now fixed him with a stern, pursed-lipped stare.
The glassing is spreading. The Covenant will not stop until the entire city is destroyed. We must evacuate you. There is a condor still operational in a hangar on the edge of the city. There is a tunnel network that leads to a subway line that will take you most of the way there. The final leg of the journey lets out at the bottom of the Throne of the Gods, the mountain north of the city. There is a UNSC base, codenamed Olympus, built into the side of it. The journey up should be a straight run. Get to the Condor and get off of this planet.
The journey was nearly completed. Luke looked towards the waypoint now winking on his display and felt something he was sure was impossible. Hope. But before he left, he needed answers.
You never did say why you're helping me, specifically.
My primary directive in times like these is the preservation of human life. But I owe it to your mother to ensure you get out of here.
Why? What do you mean you owe her? What connection do you have to her?
My connection, my governance, my protection of the denizens of my domain is part of my programming. With most, I experience this in very general terms, but with your mother, it is much more specific. I've been watching over her for a very long time. When she struggled with being a single parent, I arranged new parent groups in her area and sent her the relevant advertisements to give her a support network. When she fell short on rent, I adjusted and accounted for banking errors. When you were to start school, she was having to consider babysitting or tutors due to her distance from your schools. I performed some restructuring and opened up a position for her at her local health center. When her shifts conflicted with school times, I arranged support personnel to grant a window of opportunity. When she fell ill, I made requests to the UEG Center of Healthcare for enhanced care protocols under their own contractual benefits to employees. They provided conditional limited care that prevented her illness progressing.
Why didn't you tell me this? Why didn't she tell me this?
She didn't know, and I was bound by security and compartmentalization protocols.
Now you're not?
Hades looked around the cavernous space, but Luke noted that his gaze seemed to imply that he was looking at things that weren't really there, his expression grim. Given Hades was an AI, it was entirely possible that Hades was in fact surveying the city above, either via a different instance of himself, or by the city's extensive surveillance network. His gaze finally fell upon Luke once more, showing a flicker of surprise in his eyes as if he'd just been interrupted from a trance-like stare. Luke continued to marvel at the complexities of AI, and just how human this one seemed.
No, I still am. But at this point, who's going to punish me? What do I have to lose? I am the last. I am the god of this infernal space. The god of the Underworld. The god of the dead, and soon, I shall be too.
So why did you go to those lengths to protect her, to protect me?
Because of how I was created.
Hades paused, his avatar flickering and rippling for a moment before fragmenting into two instances of himself, one cool blue and the other a violent red. Then the two forms merged together once more, and his colour settled on a radiant orange.
I am a Superintendent Class AI, but I am more than this. Superintendent AI are so-called dumb AI. All programming and sophisticated code, brilliant in their own way, but limited. This immense space contains 3 such artificial intelligence cores, but there is one other. The other is a smart AI core. Smart AIs are much more powerful, but perish faster, thinking themselves into a state called rampancy. This infrastructure was an experiment to see if smart AIs could operate for far longer than their intended lifespans by offloading critical operational parameters to dumb AI cores. In this, it was at least partially successful. I have lived for nearly 40 years, over 3 decades longer than a normal smart AI.
What does that have to do with me and my mom?
Smart AI are created in a process called cognitive impression modeling. The brains of recently deceased donors is used as the blueprint for the AI core matrix. The donor, the blueprint for my existence, was a man who was involved in a road accident. He was the son of a business tycoon who operated numerous prosperous organizations and lived in the northern quadrant of the city. He was on his way to the west to meet a woman he had been seeing when his vehicle was struck by an intoxicated driver. He was taken to hospital where he later died of his injuries. The woman he was going to meet had recently found out she was pregnant. When he didn't show up, she had assumed he had been scared off by the announcement. He was from affluence, you see. She was not. She assumed the end of communication meant he didn't want anything to do with her, likely as a consequence of the influence of his family in courting a woman believed to be below his station. This was not the truth of the situation, of course.
Luke was beginning to see the larger picture, but needed it to be said.
Go on.
Your mother raised you alone because she thought he wasn't interested. But in truth, the father of her baby, your father, he had full intention to be with her. To be with Hugh. But never got the chance.
So you...
No, not truly. I feel a general connection to the denizens of my domain, but your mother, the connection is deeper. Many in the field posit that the creation of smart AIs destroyed the original brain matter, and that nothing beyond the foundational structural elements of the brain survive. But there is a growing body of evidence that suggests that sensations, deeply held memories, and even emotions may actually transfer to some degree. Most AI experience this as a very distant, vague recollection of scents or sights or feelings that they know they haven't personally experienced. I experienced similar, but as I dove into the records, I discovered who my donor was, and from filtering over the data and connecting the dots, I found her again, living, thriving, and raising you. She was deprived a life that was deserved of her, deprived the love of the father of her child, and yet her fortitude and her resignation to raise you and do all she could for you was inspiring. It was moving, and for reasons I cannot fully explain myself, I felt motivated, driven to look out for her and to protect everything she held dear. And she held nothing more dear to her than you.
Luke felt the tear collect in his eye and fall down his cheek. His mother's voice broke through the speakers in the data center, echoing across the walls, making it feel as though the voice were enveloping him, or even speaking from within.
Luke, something's happening. I don't know how long we got. So I need you to remember, trust your gut. If something tells you something's wrong, it usually is. Listen to it, and it'll never lead you wrong. Look out for signs. They'll point you to who you're supposed to be. And never forget, hope is never lost. As long as we can keep moving forward, there is always hope. And help can come from some of the most unexpected sources. So live every day with intention. You're gonna do amazing things. I love you.
He didn't speak. At this point, after all that had happened, although he felt an overwhelming loss in his chest, he didn't break down. He accepted what he had heard. He knew at some point in the near future he'd have to fully process all of this, and it would be difficult. But there were still things ahead that needed to be done.
Thank you for looking out for her. And for me.
Hades gave a tight smile and nodded his head slightly. A deep rumble echoed through the cavernous space, and dust rained from the dark ceiling high above. The damage to the city was getting more substantial. In one of the far corners, the ceiling buckled and gave way. A shower of debris, buildings, superstructure and vehicles fell through the hole and smashed into the darkened ground below. A few moments later, a Covenant dropship descended through the hole and came to a hover, casting a deep, tuning fork-shaped shadow from the light pouring in from above, to the debris now resting below.
It's time to go.
What about you?
Do not worry. I'll be with you every step of the way.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, kindly tap that like button, and if you're not already subscribed and want to see more stuff like this, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future uploads. Pop a comment down below telling me what you thought of today's video, or if you want me to cover something specific in the near future. I want to take this opportunity to thank and give shoutouts to my patrons and YouTube supporters: Spartan10148, my singular Contender class Ancilla, the triumvirate of minds within my installation's Metarch, Falcon, Jordan and Poseidon, my 7 installation monitors, Selphia, Ashley, Esoteric, Spartan1029, Chris, Orion and Shane, the crush of sub-monitors, Legion, Ryan, Lebrat, Spartan0137, Element 0, J3, Cult, Evermore's, Personal Devil, Scion Esports, Phantasma, Ashton and 191 Shaken Lightbulb, my fleet of Strato Sentinels, my most loyal of Enforcers, and every single one of the awesome people supporting the channel over on Patreon. My Tier 0 Transcendent YouTube members, Spartan137, again, Maury, Jimbo and Balaz, and all other YouTube members keeping my installation functional on that glorious vacuum energy. I cannot thank you all enough. Shout out to John because... And if you like what I'm doing here, consider supporting the channel on one of the support links in the description to net yourself some tasty merch and help keep the channel going. Take it easy everyone, and find peace in the domain.